Look at your mind for a moment. That peculiar stream of thoughts flowing through your awareness right now. The commentary that never stops, that judges everything, even these words I'm sharing with you. Have you ever paused to wonder who exactly is doing all this talking in your head? I find it rather amusing that most of us spend our entire lives listening to this internal monologue without ever questioning its source. We simply assume that's me thinking and carry on. But is it really? Are you creating these thoughts, or are they simply arising in you, like clouds forming in the sky? And if that voice is truly you, then who is the one listening to it? Who is aware of these thoughts? Isn't that awareness also you? This paradox, the speaker and the listener seemingly existing in the same mind, points to something quite extraordinary about the nature of consciousness itself. Today, let's explore this magnificent puzzle together, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as an invitation to discover something fundamental about your existence, something that might just transform how you experience every moment of your life. Let us begin with something you're experiencing right now. As you're hearing these words, there's a voice in your head that's following along, isn't there? Perhaps it's repeating what I'm saying, or perhaps it's commenting on it. Yes, that's true. Or, I'm not sure about that, or even, I wonder where he's going with this. Now, here's the peculiar thing. If you pay very close attention to this voice, you'll notice something rather odd. You cannot predict with certainty what this voice is going to say next. If you could, there would be no point in its speaking, would there? It's rather like reading a novel. If you already knew every word on every page, the act of reading would be utterly superfluous. And yet, we have the strongest sensation that this voice is me. I am thinking, we say. But am I doing the thinking, or is thinking happening to me? You see, we have this extraordinary assumption that because thoughts occur in your head, they must be yours, that you are creating them, like a spider spinning a web. But when you truly look for the thinker, the one who supposedly initiates each thought, you find yourself in a very curious position indeed. Try it for yourself right now. Try to think your next thought. What will it be? You don't know, do you? Until it appears. And by the time you know what your next thought will be, it's already happened. So who exactly is doing the thinking? We might say, the brain is thinking much as the heart is beating or the lungs are breathing. But we don't say, I am beating my heart, or I am breathing my lungs, at least not unless we're consciously controlling our breath. No, we recognize that these are processes happening within us, largely autonomously. What if thinking is exactly the same? What if thoughts arise in consciousness much as waves arise from the ocean, not separate from it, but a movement of the whole, is less than #0? 5# is greater than. The inner voice, you see, is not so much your creation as it is a process you're witnessing. And this voice has been shaped by everything you've ever experienced, your parents, your education, books you've read, conversations you've had, the very culture you've grown up in. So when the voice speaks of I, of me, of myself, what is it really referring to? Is it referring to the true you, or merely to a character it's been rehearsing all your life? A fascinating question, isn't it? Now this brings us to what I consider one of the most extraordinary illusions of human existence. The way we've come to mistake this inner narrator for our very self. You see, from the moment we learn language, we're taught a most peculiar game. We're given a name and told, you are John, or you are Mary, as if this collection of sensations, feelings, and experiences could be contained in a single word. And gradually, through the years, we build up a story. I was born on such and such a date to these parents, in this place. I went to this school. I have these talents and these failings. I am this sort of person. And the voice in our head becomes the narrator of this story, constantly updating our biography, constantly telling us who we are. I'm the kind of person who likes jazz but can't stand opera. I'm not very good at mathematics. I'm rather sensitive about my appearance. On and on it goes, weaving this fictional character that we take to be ourselves. But, you see, this is a case of mistaken identity of the most profound kind. It's rather like going to the theatre and becoming so absorbed in the play that you forget you're watching actors. You temporarily believe in the reality of Hamlet or Ophelia, but in this case the play has been going on so long your entire life that you've utterly forgotten it's a performance. This separate self, this ego as we call it in the West, or what Buddhists call the Maya, the illusion it isn't actually an entity at all. It's a process. It's something your organism is doing, not something your organism is. Consider, when you say I think or I feel, what exactly is this I that thinks and feels? If you try to point to it, what can you point to? Your body. But your body is constantly changing. Every 7 years or so, practically every cell is replaced. Your memories. But these too change, some fade. Some are embellished. Some are entirely fabricated without your realizing it. What remains constant? Only this sense of I, this center of narrative gravity that the voice in your head continuously refers to. But when you look for it directly, it's like trying to catch your own shadow. The closer you get, the more it recedes. And yet, how desperately we cling to it. How terrified we are at the prospect of losing this sense of self. We call it depersonalization or ego death and consider it pathological. But what if it's the clinging to this illusion that's the true pathology? You see, the separate self is useful as a social convention, rather like money. We all agree to pretend it exists because it makes certain interactions possible. But the trouble begins when we mistake the convention for reality. When we begin to believe that this I, this inner voice, is our authentic being. It's rather like the image of yourself in a mirror, useful for combing your hair, but you wouldn't try to feed it breakfast, would you? Yet in a sense that's exactly what we do with this conceptual self. We spend our lives trying to satisfy its endless demands, to live up to its impossible standards, to defend it against imagined slights. What would happen, I wonder, if we stopped mistaking the voice for the true self? If we recognized it as merely one function of consciousness among many, perhaps something far more interesting than our familiar inner narrator might reveal itself. There's a most peculiar paradox at the heart of this inquiry. When you attempt to observe the voice in your head, to watch your own thoughts as they arise, who exactly is doing the watching? It seems there's an observer standing apart from the thoughts, doesn't it? But if you look closely at this observer, you'll notice something extraordinary. It too becomes an object of observation. It's rather like trying to bite your own teeth or see your own eyes without a mirror. The Western philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein put it beautifully when he said, "The eye that sees is not itself in the field of vision. You see everything except the seeing itself." And yet, the seeing is happening, isn't it? The Hindus have a wonderful term for this. They call it the witness, or in Sanskrit, sakshi. This witnessing presence that is aware of everything, including your thoughts, but cannot itself be turned into an object of awareness. It's always the subject, never the object. Now, here's where things get truly fascinating. In the West, we've been conditioned to believe that consciousness is something the brain produces, rather like the liver produces bile. It's an epiphenomenon, a side effect of neural activity. But this explanation has always struck me as backwards. It's like saying that a television set creates the programs you watch. No, the television receives signals and translates them into images and sounds. What if the brain is more like a receiver than a producer? What if consciousness is not something the brain creates, but something it tunes into? The Vedantic philosophers of India have long maintained that consciousness is not a product, but the fundamental ground of being. They call it Brahman, or sometimes Atman, when referring to its expression in individual beings. It's not something you have, but what you are at the most fundamental level. Consider this. When you're deeply absorbed in a beautiful sunset, or in making love, or in a piece of music, those moments when the chattering voice momentarily falls silent, does your consciousness disappear? No. In fact, it becomes more vivid, more immediate, more real. The commentary stops, but the awareness remains, doesn't it? This suggests something quite revolutionary, that the true nature of consciousness might not be the inner voice at all, but the aware space in which the voice appears. Not the thoughts, but the knowing of the thoughts. But here we encounter another delicious paradox, because as soon as you try to grasp this pure awareness, to hold it and examine it, it slips away. The very act of trying to observe it turns it into an object, which it can never be. It's rather like trying to see darkness with a flashlight. The moment you shine the light, the darkness vanishes. You can never catch it. And yet, darkness exists, doesn't it? This is why I've always been amused by the philosophical problem of solipsism, the worry that one can never prove the existence of other minds. The real puzzle is that one cannot even prove the existence of one's own mind, at least not as an object of study. So you see, when we ask, "Who is speaking in my head?" we're falling into a trap. We're assuming that consciousness is a thing, a noun, when perhaps it's better understood as a process, a verb. Not a thinker who thinks, but thinking itself. Not a seer who sees, but seeing itself. Not a hearer who hears, but hearing itself. And the greatest joke of all is that what you truly are is not a separate entity trying to understand consciousness, but consciousness itself playing at being a separate entity. Let's now consider something rather remarkable about this voice in our heads. Have you noticed that it speaks in a language? English, perhaps, or French, or Japanese, whatever tongue you were taught as a child. And language, you see, is inherently social. It's a system of communication between people. What this suggests is something quite profound. The voice in your head, this supposedly private phenomenon, is actually social in its very structure. You're talking to yourself in exactly the same way others once talked to you. When a child is learning to tie their shoelaces, the parent says, "First, take this lace over that one, then pull it under and through the loop." Later the child will repeat these same instructions to themselves as they learn the skill. Over, under, through the loop. Eventually they no longer need the verbal instructions, but that inner dialogue was essential in the learning process. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky called this inner speech, and recognized that it begins as outer speech, as actual conversations with others that we gradually internalize. Your inner voice, in other words, is a chorus of all the voices you've ever heard, all the instructions you've been given, all the judgments that have been passed on you. Have you ever noticed that your inner critic often sounds suspiciously like a parent or a teacher from your childhood? That's not a coincidence. It literally is their voice, absorbed into your psyche. And it's not just individual voices we internalize, but entire cultural patterns of thought. If you were raised in a Western society, your inner voice is likely analytical, categorizing, dividing the world into subjects and objects. If you were raised in traditional Japan or China, it might be more relational, more attuned to context and connection. The ancient Greeks had no concept of conscience as we understand it today, that inner voice that tells you right from wrong. Instead, they believed that the gods spoke directly to them. A Greek warrior might say, "Athena whispered in my ear that I should spare this man." Today we'd say, "My conscience told me to spare him." Same phenomenon, entirely different interpretation. What I find fascinating is that we've internalized not just specific voices, but an entire model of what it means to be a self. In the West, this model is heavily influenced by Christianity, with its emphasis on the individual soul, and by Descartes, with his famous "I think, therefore I am." We've been taught to identify with our thoughts, to believe that thinking is the core of our being. But this is a cultural bias, not a universal truth. In many Eastern traditions, the true self is found in the silence beneath thought, in the space between words. As the Zen saying goes, the mind is like a monkey jumping from branch to branch. The goal is not to identify with the monkey, but to observe its antics with detached amusement. And there's something tremendously liberating in recognizing the social origins of our inner voice. Because once you see that your thoughts are not entirely your own, that they're a collection of internalized conversations, cultural assumptions, and learned responses, you can begin to hold them more lightly. You can begin to ask, is this thought really mine? Does it serve me? Is it even true? You can start to discriminate between the useful aspects of your conditioning and the harmful ones. And most importantly, you can begin to see that you are not obligated to believe everything you think. Just because a thought appears in your head doesn't mean it's true, or important, or worthy of attention. It may simply be an old recording, playing one more time. This is what the Buddhists mean by non-attachment to thoughts. Not suppressing them or fighting them, but recognizing their constructed nature and therefore not being tyrannized by them. It's rather like watching clouds pass across the sky. You don't try to stop the clouds, nor do you run after them. You simply observe their passing, knowing that they are not the sky itself. Your thoughts, too, are merely passing clouds in the vast sky of your awareness. Now, I've always been fascinated by the Eastern approaches to this puzzle of consciousness, particularly those found in Zen Buddhism and Taoism. They offer us such a refreshingly different perspective from our Western habits of thought. In Zen, there is a wonderful concept called no mind, or mushin in Japanese. It doesn't mean the absence of consciousness, but rather consciousness without the cluttering activity of the ego mind. It's the state a master archer enters when releasing the arrow, or a master painter when the brush seems to move by itself. There's a famous Zen story about a centipede who was asked how he coordinated all his 100 legs. The moment he started thinking about it, he became paralyzed and couldn't walk at all. This is a perfect metaphor for what happens when the analyzing mind interferes with the natural functioning of consciousness. The Zen masters developed a practice called Zazen, or sitting meditation. But unlike Western forms of meditation that often involve concentration on an object or idea, Zazen is about sitting with no goal, no intention, no attempt to control the mind. Just sitting, just being. When a thought arises, you neither follow it nor suppress it. You simply acknowledge its presence and let it pass, like watching a boat appear on the horizon and then sail away again without feeling any need to jump aboard. What the Zen practitioners discovered through this seemingly simple practice was profound. When you stop identifying with the voice in your head, when you cease believing that you are your thoughts, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries between self and other, between subject and object, begin to dissolve. This is what they call satori, or awakening the direct experiential realization that your true nature is not the separate self constructed by thought, but something far more vast and interconnected. The Taoists approach this from a slightly different angle. They speak of the Tao, the way, which cannot be spoken of or conceptualized. As Lao Tzu famously said, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The moment you try to capture it in words or concepts, you've already lost it. For the Taoist, the chattering mind, what they call the monkey mind, is not your enemy to be conquered, but simply a natural function that has been allowed to dominate inappropriately. Like a servant who has forgotten his place and now acts as if he were the master of the house. The goal is not to silence the servant, but to restore the proper order. To remember who is truly in charge. And the true master, in the Taoist view, is not another voice, not a superego or higher self, but the silent awareness that precedes all voices. The Tao Te Ching says, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." This isn't an anti-intellectual stance, but a recognition that genuine understanding transcends conceptual thought. It's the difference between reading a menu and tasting the food, between reading about swimming and actually diving into the water. What I find most valuable in both these traditions is their emphasis on direct experience rather than belief or theory. They offer practices, not doctrines. They don't ask you to believe anything, but rather to look for yourself, to examine your own consciousness with patient attention and see what's really there. And what they both point to, in their different ways, is that the voice in your head is not your deepest identity. It's a surface phenomenon, like waves on the ocean. Useful, certainly, but no more you than your heartbeat or your digestion. The true you, if we can even use such a term, is the awareness in which all phenomena, including thoughts, appear. It's the knowing, not the known. The seeing, not the seen. And this brings us to perhaps the most radical implication of Eastern thought, that this deepest level of awareness might not be personal at all. That your consciousness and my consciousness might be like two waves on the same ocean, apparently separate from a limited perspective, but in reality manifestations of a single underlying reality. As the Upanishads put it, Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. Your true nature is not separate from the ultimate nature of reality itself. Now, let's be very clear about something. I'm not suggesting that thinking is bad, or that we should try to stop the voice in our head. That would be like saying digestion is bad and we should try to stop our stomachs from working. The problem isn't thinking itself, but our relationship to thinking. You see, thinking is a marvelous tool. It allows us to plan, to remember, to create, to solve problems. Without conceptual thought, we couldn't build bridges or compose symphonies or develop vaccines. We couldn't even have this conversation. But in the West, we've developed a peculiar relationship with this tool. We've come to worship it, to identify with it completely, to believe that it's the core of our being. It's as if we've decided that the most important thing about a carpenter is his hammer. And this over-identification with thought has led to a kind of tyranny. For many of us, the voice in our head never stops. It chatters away constantly, commenting, judging, reminiscing, worrying, planning. And we think this is normal, even necessary. But is it? Is this constant internal monologue really essential to our functioning? Or might it actually be an impediment to our deepest well-being? Consider, when are you most happy, most fulfilled, most vibrantly alive? Is it when you're lost in thought, when the voice is chattering away 19 to the dozen? Or is it when you're completely absorbed in something in nature, in art, in sport, in love, when the voice momentarily falls silent and you're simply present to what is? Most people, if they're honest, will admit it's the latter. The moments of pure presence, of absorption, are the moments when we feel most alive, most real. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls this state flow, and his research shows it's consistently associated with the deepest forms of human satisfaction. But here's the rub. You can't think your way to flow. In fact, excessive thinking is the primary barrier to entering this state. The moment you start thinking about being in flow, you're no longer in it. This points to something profound. There's a mode of consciousness available to us that doesn't depend on the voice in our head. A way of knowing that doesn't rely on words or concepts. A form of intelligence that's direct, intuitive, non-symbolic. The pianist doesn't need to name each note as he plays. The dancer doesn't need to verbally instruct her limbs. The master chef doesn't consult an internal recipe book for every pinch of salt. There's a knowing in the doing that transcends thought. This is what we might call embodied intelligence, as opposed to conceptual intelligence. And it's available to all of us all the time, if we would only stop drowning it out with our incessant internal chatter. So how do we break the tyranny of constant thinking? How do we restore thought to its proper role as a tool rather than a master? Well, we certainly don't do it by fighting against thought, by trying to forcibly silence the voice. That's just more thinking. It's like trying to smooth ripples on a pond by slapping at them with your hand. You only create more ripples. No, the way to quiet the mind is through awareness. By becoming conscious of your thinking as it happens. By watching the voice rather than being wholly identified with it. When you watch your thoughts without judgment, without trying to change them, something remarkable happens. They begin to lose their compulsive quality. They begin to slow down of their own accord. Gaps begin to appear in the previously solid stream of mental chatter. And in those gaps you may catch a glimpse of something extraordinary, the aware space in which thoughts arise. the consciousness that precedes thinking and continues after it subsides. The real you, if you will, as opposed to the idea of you that the voice is constantly constructing and defending. Have you ever noticed that there are brief moments between your thoughts? Tiny gaps in the seemingly continuous stream of mental chatter? Most of us rush past these gaps, eager to get to the next thought, like someone channel surfing who can't bear a moment of static between programs. But what if the most important aspect of consciousness isn't the content of our thoughts at all, but these gaps between them? What if, in our rush to identify with the voice in our head, we've been overlooking the silent witness that hears the voice? I'm reminded of a wonderful metaphor from the Indian tradition. They compare consciousness to the sky and thoughts to clouds passing through it. We've become so fixated on the clouds that we've forgotten the sky. But the sky was there before the clouds formed, and it will be there after they disperse. It's more fundamental, more essential than any cloud. Similarly, your awareness precedes and outlasts any particular thought. It's the container in which all experiences, including thinking, occur. And just as the sky isn't stained by the clouds that pass through it, your fundamental awareness isn't altered by the thoughts it witnesses. This silent witness, this pure consciousness, has a remarkable quality. It's impersonal. Now that might sound rather cold or detached, but I assure you it's not. By impersonal, I don't mean unfeeling or uncaring, but rather not limited to what we normally think of as a person, not confined to the biographical details and psychological characteristics that the voice in your head identifies as me. This witness doesn't judge, doesn't crave, doesn't fear. It simply observes with a clarity and compassion that transcends our usual egoic concerns. It's what the Buddhists call bare attention, awareness without commentary, seeing without conceptualizing. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that this witness is some sort of homunculus, a little person inside your head watching the show. That would just push the problem back one step. Who would be watching the watcher? No, what I'm pointing to is consciousness itself, not as a thing, but as the space in which all things appear. Here's an exercise you might try. For just a few moments, see if you can rest your attention in the space between thoughts. Don't try to silence your mind, that's just more thinking. Simply notice the brief gaps that naturally occur and linger there in that open spaciousness. What you may discover is that this silent presence, this awareness, is actually your most fundamental identity. It's what's left when all the mental constructions of self have been seen through. It's what you are, beneath all your ideas about what you are. And this isn't some exotic state accessible only to yogis in caves. It's available to everyone, all the time. In fact, it's so close, so intimate, so fundamental, that we overlook it, like fish who don't notice the water they swim in. The great joke is that we've been searching for enlightenment, for liberation, for our true nature, as if it were some distant achievement, when in fact it's the very consciousness in which the search itself is occurring. It's like a person who goes all over town asking where the town is. Now, some of you might be thinking, this sounds all very mystical and abstract. What practical difference does it make? Well, let me tell you, it makes all the difference in the world. When you recognize that you are not limited to the voice in your head, that your fundamental identity is the awareness in which the voice appears, an extraordinary kind of freedom becomes possible. You're no longer tyrannized by your thoughts, no longer compelled to believe or act upon everything the voice tells you. This doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you hold your thoughts more lightly, with less attachment, less identification. You can use thought when it's helpful, and set it aside when it's not. You can recognize negative thought patterns for what they are, habitual movements of mind, not statements of truth. In this space between thoughts, you reconnect with the immediacy of direct experience. Colors seem brighter, sounds clearer, sensations more vivid. It's as if a veil has been lifted from your perception, a filter removed. And perhaps most importantly, in this silent awareness, you discover a peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances or internal states. It's not the peace of having everything go your way, or of feeling particularly positive emotions. It's the peace of knowing yourself as that which is untouched by the ever-changing play of phenomena. The peace of being the sky, not the clouds. I'd like to propose something rather outrageous now. What if this whole drama of consciousness, this dance of the voice in your head and the silent witness, is actually a grand game that consciousness is playing with itself? A cosmic hide-and-seek, if you will. You see, there's a delicious paradox at the heart of existence. Consciousness in its fundamental nature is undifferentiated, unitary, whole. The Hindus call this Brahman pure being, pure awareness, pure bliss. But such undifferentiated oneness, while perfect, would also be perfectly boring. There would be no play, no discovery, no surprise. So what does consciousness do? It plays a game with itself. It pretends to divide itself, to forget its true nature. It creates the illusion of separateness, of multiplicity, of me and not me. It's rather like a dreamer who divides himself into all the characters in his dream and then has them interact with each other, forgetting that they're all aspects of himself. The voice in your head, what we call the ego, is a key player in this game. Its job is to maintain the illusion of separation, to convince you that you are a discrete entity in a world of other discrete entities. And it does this job admirably well, is less than #0. 5# is greater than. So well, in fact, that most of us completely forget that it's a game. But occasionally the veil slips. In moments of profound love or aesthetic rapture or mystical insight, we glimpse the underlying unity. We sense, however fleetingly, that the boundaries between self and other aren't as solid as we thought, that we're not isolated fragments in an indifferent universe, but expressions of the universe itself, the universe becoming conscious of itself through us. This is what the Zen masters call Satori, or what the Advaita Vedantists call self-realization. Not the acquisition of some new knowledge or state, but the recognition of what was always already the case, that your deepest identity is not separate from the ground of being itself. But here's the beautiful thing. Recognizing the game doesn't end it. In fact, it enhances it. Just as understanding that a magic trick is an illusion doesn't diminish our enjoyment of the performance, seeing through the illusion of separateness doesn't reduce our engagement with life. On the contrary, it infuses every experience with a sense of wonder and play. Think of it this way. We go to the theater knowing full well that what we're about to see isn't literally real. The actors aren't really the characters they portray. The sets aren't actually ancient Rome or a spacecraft. But this knowledge doesn't prevent us from becoming emotionally invested in the story. In fact, it's precisely because we know it's a play that we can surrender to it so completely. We don't need to maintain our defenses because we know at a deeper level that it's all in fun. Similarly, when we recognize the game that consciousness is playing with itself, we can participate in life with greater abandon, greater joy, greater compassion. We don't need to defend our illusory boundaries quite so fiercely because we know they're not ultimately real. We don't need to take the voice in our head quite so seriously because we recognize it as just one player in a much larger performance. And this brings us back to our central question, who speaks in your head? From this perspective, we might say that it's consciousness itself playing a game of pretending to be a separate self. The voice isn't speaking to you, it's an aspect of you, of the larger you that encompasses both the voice and the listening. I'm reminded of a delightful metaphor from the Vedanta tradition. They compare the universe to a spider's web. The spider extrudes the web from its own body and then lives upon what it has created. In the same way, consciousness creates the world of forms from itself and then experiences that world as if it were separate from it. Or to use another analogy, it's like the sun shining on the moon. The light we see reflected from the moon is actually sunlight. The sun is experiencing its own light bounced back to it, as if from something other. But it's all sunlight. So the voice in your head, the silent witness, and everything else in your experience, they're all movements of the same consciousness playing hide and seek with itself. And the most extraordinary thing is that you are that consciousness. Not the limited you that the voice is always concerned about, but the unlimited you that is the ground of all being. We've been exploring this voice in our heads, this consciousness that seems so intimately ours. But I'd like to turn our attention now to a more radical possibility. What if consciousness isn't something that belongs to us at all? What if instead we belong to it? You see, we in the West have been raised on a myth, the myth of the independent, autonomous self. We imagine that each of us is a kind of island of awareness, peering out at a world that exists objectively out there. We believe that our consciousness is generated by our brains, contained within our skulls, and fundamentally separate from everything else. But there's another way of understanding this. What if consciousness isn't a product of the brain, but a fundamental property of the universe itself? What if awareness is primary, not secondary? What if, as the idealist philosophers have suggested, mind doesn't emerge from matter, but matter emerges from mind? This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound to our materialist ears. After all, everything we know about the physical world comes to us through consciousness. We've never experienced an atom, a neuron, a brain, or even our own bodies, except as phenomena appearing in awareness. The only thing we know directly, without inference or interpretation, is consciousness itself. As the philosopher Schopenhauer put it, the world is my representation. Or to quote Bishop Berkeley, to be is to be perceived, esse percipi. The material world as we know it is inseparable from the consciousness that perceives it. This isn't to say that nothing exists outside of our individual minds that would be solipsism, which is just another form of the separate self-illusion. Rather, it's to suggest that mind and matter aren't two fundamentally different kinds of stuff, but different aspects or expressions of a deeper unity. The ancient Vedantic philosophers of India expressed this in the concept of non-duality, or Advaita in Sanskrit. Not one, not two. Neither monism nor dualism, but a recognition that the apparent separation between subject and object, mind and matter, self and world, is ultimately an illusion, a useful convention for certain purposes, but not the fundamental truth. Modern physics, interestingly, has been moving in a similar direction. The old Newtonian model of a clockwork universe made of discrete particles has given way to quantum field theory, where solid things dissolve into probability waves, and the observer cannot be separated from the observed. As the physicist James Jeans remarked, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. So what does this mean for our understanding of the voice in our heads? If consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but is a fundamental property of reality itself, then the thoughts that arise in our awareness aren't really ours in the way we usually assume. They're more like local movements in a vast field of consciousness, temporary patterns in an infinite ocean of awareness. It's rather like waves on the surface of the sea. Each wave appears distinct, with its own shape and movement, but it's made of the same water as every other wave, and ultimately as the sea itself. Your thoughts, my thoughts, all conscious experiences, everywhere they're like different waves in the same ocean of mind. Now, this doesn't mean that individual consciousness doesn't exist, any more than saying that waves are water means that waves don't exist. Clearly, there's a difference between your experience and mine. The pattern of consciousness that I call me is not identical to the pattern you call you. But it does suggest that our separateness is not as absolute as we tend to believe. We're more like whirlpools in a river than isolated containers of water. We're processes, not things, temporary forms that the flow of consciousness takes on its eternal journey. The Buddhists express this in their teaching of anatta, or no self. They're not saying that you don't exist at all, but that you don't exist as a permanent, independent, unchanging entity. You're more like a verb than a noun, a happening rather than a thing. And this brings us to a profound insight about the voice in our heads. If consciousness is not confined to our brains, but is a field in which our brains participate, then the thoughts that arise in our awareness aren't simply products of our individual minds. They're expressions of a larger intelligence, a cosmic creativity that's thinking through us. This doesn't mean that some external deity is controlling our thoughts, but rather that what we call our thoughts are part of a much vaster process of consciousness coming to know itself through myriad forms and perspectives. We're not isolated transmitters, but nodes in an infinite network, both receiving and contributing to the ongoing conversation of the universe. When I really contemplate this, I'm filled with a sense of wonder and relief. Wonder at the extraordinary dance of awareness that's expressing itself through all things, and relief at the recognition that I don't have to figure everything out on my own, that I'm not responsible for generating every creative thought or insight. I can relax into being a conduit, a participant in the great unfolding of consciousness, rather than an isolated controller. And this, I think, is the greatest freedom of all, to recognize that the voice in your head isn't your possession or your master, but simply one of the infinite ways in which the universe is singing to itself. You can enjoy its music without having to claim ownership of the orchestra. So where does all this leave us, practically speaking? If the voice in our head isn't our deepest identity, if consciousness isn't confined to our brains, if we're not separate selves, but expressions of a universal awareness, what difference does this make to our everyday lives? Well, I'd suggest it makes all the difference in the world. Because how we understand ourselves fundamentally shapes how we live. And the shift we're talking about from identifying with the voice in your head to recognizing yourself as the awareness in which that voice appears is the most radical and liberating transformation possible. When you're caught up in the voice, when you believe that you are your thoughts, you're living in what we might call narrative consciousness. Life becomes a story you're telling yourself, with you as the protagonist, everything else as supporting characters or props, and an endless stream of commentary running through your head. This narrative is always incomplete, always biased, always colored by your fears and desires and cultural conditioning. It's not reality itself, but a map of reality, and as the semanticist Alfred Korzybski famously remarked, the map is not the territory. Living from narrative consciousness means being perpetually caught in the gap between how things are and how your story says they should be. It means endless striving, endless dissatisfaction, endless seeking for a future moment when everything will finally be as the voice says it ought to be. But there's another possibility. We can shift from narrative consciousness to what we might call presence consciousness. From living in our mental maps to living in the territory itself. From being caught in the story to being awake to the actuality of this moment. In presence consciousness, the voice in your head may still speak, but you're not identified with it. It becomes one aspect of your experience, like the sound of traffic or the sensation of your breath, something happening within awareness, not the totality of who you are. And with this shift, something remarkable happens. The sense of lack, of something missing, of needing to get somewhere other than here, it begins to dissolve. Because presence consciousness is inherently complete. It doesn't need anything added to it to be fulfilled. It's already whole, already perfect, just as it is. This doesn't mean you stop engaging with life, or pursuing goals, or trying to improve things, but the nature of your engagement changes fundamentally. You're no longer acting from a sense of inner deficiency, trying to fill a hole that can never be filled. You're acting from a sense of abundance, from the joy of expression rather than the anxiety of acquisition. It's rather like the difference between someone who dances in order to get somewhere to reach a specific point on the dance floor and someone who dances for the sheer joy of dancing. The steps may be exactly the same, but the quality of the experience is worlds apart. Living from presence means that each moment is fresh, new, alive with possibilities. You're not trapped in the grooves of habitual thought patterns, not imprisoned by your personal history or future anxieties. You're available to what's actually happening, responsive rather than reactive. And paradoxically, when you stop identifying exclusively with the voice in your head, you become more authentically yourself. Because the self that the voice is so concerned about, the biographical self, the psychological self, the self-image, is just a construct, a convenient fiction. Your true nature is far more vast, far more mysterious, far more alive than any story you could tell about yourself. The Persian poet Rumi captured this beautifully when he wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." That field is presence consciousness, the aware space in which all experiences, including the voice, arise. So how do we make this shift from narrative to presence? It's not a matter of forcing the voice to be quiet, that's just more narrative, more struggle. It's about recognizing what's already present beneath and beyond the voice. One way is through direct inquiry. When you notice the voice chattering away, ask yourself, who or what is aware of this voice? Who is listening? This isn't a question to be answered conceptually, but a pointer to direct experience. It's an invitation to shift your attention from the content of consciousness to consciousness itself. Another approach is through what we might call sense door practice. Bring your attention fully to your immediate sensory experience, the sounds around you, the sensations in your body, the colors and shapes in your visual field. Not thinking about these things, but directly experiencing them. This naturally draws you out of narrative and into presence. And perhaps the simplest method is just to pause several times throughout your day and notice the space between your thoughts. Not trying to create this space, but recognizing that it's already there. Resting in that spaciousness, that openness, that silence. Recognizing it as your most fundamental nature. What you may discover through any of these approaches is that presence isn't something you need to achieve or attain. It's what you already are, underneath all the layers of narrative, beneath all the voices in your head. It's the ground of your being, the foundation of your experience. And as you learn to live more and more from this ground, the question, who speaks in my head, begins to lose its urgency. Because you recognize that the voice, whoever or whatever it is not the author of your existence. It's just one note in the symphony of consciousness, one wave in the ocean of awareness. And you are not the voice, nor even the listener, but the listening itself. Not a thing in the world, but the openness in which the world appears. Not a separate self struggling to find meaning, but meaning itself expressing itself in endless forms. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our exploration. We began with a question, who speaks in your head? And we've journeyed through many perspectives, from the psychological to the philosophical to the mystical. But perhaps we found that the most profound answer isn't a final conclusion, but a new beginning. An invitation to shift from identifying with the voice to recognizing yourself as the awareness in which all voices arise. This isn't something to believe, but something to discover for yourself in your own direct experience. It's a journey of awakening to what you already are, beneath all the layers of conditioning, beyond all the stories you've been told and the stories you tell yourself. The 13th century Zen master Dogen put it beautifully when he said, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by all things." When you see through the illusion of the separate self, you discover your unity with all it is. Not as an abstract philosophy, but as a living reality. So I invite you to listen to the voice in your head with new ears. Not as your enemy to be silenced, nor as your essence to be obeyed, but simply as one expression of the infinite creativity of consciousness. Listen to it with curiosity, with compassion, with a sense of humor. And then listen beyond it to the silence from which it emerges and to which it returns. For it's in that silence, in that space between thoughts, that you may discover who you truly are. Not a character in a story, not a voice echoing in an empty room, but consciousness itself, boundless, timeless, and free. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Remember, the deepest truths can never be spoken, only realized. And that realization is available to you right now, in this very moment, if you're willing to look beyond the voice to the silence that holds it.